City Schools. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Urban Health Institute's second quarterly symposium. This year we've been focusing on books about Baltimore, and I think we could have used today's speaker for all four if we'd wanted to. Today we're going to have Dr. Howell Baum, who's a professor of social planning at the University of Maryland's Urban Studies and Planning program. He's written 7 books and dozens of articles on planning, school reform, race relations, public policy, and organizational behavior. From 1994 till 2000, he served as a university partner to Southeast Baltimore community members who were working to improve neighborhood schools, and that project was right here in our area at Tench Tilligman. The effort produced a Southeast Community Education Plan and a full-service community school that has been in operation for more than a decade now. He wrote about that initiative in Community Action for School Reform, which came out in 2003, and his recent book, Brown in Baltimore, School Desegregation and the Limits of Liberalism, examines the history of Baltimore school desegregation and the ways that policymakers' liberalism limited their ability to understand race and to effectively reduce racial inequality. He's currently studying how liberal and conservative beliefs about human nature influence public policy on poverty and on racial inequality. Dr. Baum's talk today is entitled Baltimore School Desegregation and Race Relations, How the Past Has Influenced the Present. And before inviting him up to the stage, I'd like to say a few words about how today is going to work. Dr. Baum will speak for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to invite up our distinguished panelists. They'll each have about 5 to 7 minutes to comment on his talk. I'll give Dr. Baum a chance to respond to their commentary, and then we'll be opening it up for a question and answer session. And our hope is that we can really engage in a real conversation about those issues here in Baltimore at that point. So without further ado, Dr. Howell Baum.
It's a pleasure to see everyone here this afternoon. We're here to talk about an anachronistic topic, which is racial segregation and integration. And it's not part of our contemporary discussion, though it should be. So I'm glad to see you all here, and I want to tell you a little story, and then I assume you have many stories and many comments of your own, and we'll have a good discussion. I'm going to tell you a story about good intentions that were frustrated. I'm going to tell you a story about Baltimore school officials who wanted to end racial segregation, but to do so without talking about race. And I think as a result, they adopted a desegregation policy that had limited impact on segregation, and I want to look at the reasons why. After telling the story, I want to look at 3 questions in particular and invite your comments on these 2. The first is, why did well-intentioned, intelligent school officials act as they did? The second is, how did school desegregation policy influence Baltimore school composition, including up to the present? And the third is, what might have happened differently to produce greater integration? So I'm going to talk about a period of 120 years in maybe 25 minutes, so I'm going to leave some events out, but I'll try to get to the important ones. We can start in 1867. Following the Civil War, the state of Maryland adopted a new constitution. The constitution required Baltimore City and the counties each to provide public schooling for black children as well as for white children. And that was the beginning of Baltimore City's running a dual school system in which schools for the races were separate and they were clearly unequal. In the early 20th century, Baltimore schools in general were not in very good condition, but the schools for black children were worse than those for white children. The buildings were decrepit, they were unsanitary, they had poor lighting, heating, and ventilation. Many of them were fire traps, many lacked indoor plumbing, many had rats. There were shortages of supplies, shortages of materials, and even in some schools, shortages of chairs, so that 2 students might sit in the same chair. And the effect of this was to produce overcrowding of black students in a small number of schools, such that a number of them had to attend school on shifts, less than a full-time day. One other thing worth noting is that many of these schools had originally been schools for white students, and the school board had declared them unfit for white students, and then had simply changed the number and the name and reopened them as schools for black children. Well, I want to say a few words about early black efforts to correct the situation. If we go back to, or we move ahead to 1935, Lily Mae Jackson was active in revitalizing the Baltimore branch of the NAACP. And Carl Murphy, who was the editor and the publisher of the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, also active in the NAACP, was active in the school effort along with Lily Mae Jackson's daughter, Juanita Jackson Mitchell. They did a great deal of research on the condition of schools for black children. They made very specific proposals. Carl Murphy angrily had pictures and stories about all of these conditions in weekly issues of the Afro. They made requests to the school board during the late 1930s and early 40s, and none of the requests was responded to in any significant way. They'd argued simply for equalizing black schools in a dual school system. By the time they got to the late 1940s, their feelings and their convictions changed, and instead of wanting equalization, they finally said, let's end segregation altogether. So they talked then about desegregating city schools. In 1952, an extraordinary thing happened, which was the Baltimore Urban League proposed to the school system that it admit black boys to the Poly A course, the advanced pre-engineering course at Poly that had its graduates admitted as sophomores to schools like MIT and others once they graduated from high school. And the Urban League, joined by the NAACP, said, look, there is no equal separate program for black children in Baltimore City, therefore you have to admit these boys to Poly. And the school board agreed. 2 years before Brown, the school board opened up one of the schools in Baltimore City, desegregated Poly before it was required to do so. And then as the Supreme Court decision on the school segregation cases became imminent and Baltimore blacks were in touch with Thurgood Marshall, who was from here, they began strategizing to influence Baltimore City school officials. And then they met with school officials and said, look, if the case comes down favorably, what we want you to do is to act immediately, and we'd like you to desegregate not just students, but also faculty, because faculty and students had both been separate at that time. So on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court came down with Brown, which said separate schools were inherently unequal schools. Within about a week, the school board of 8 whites and 1 black voted unanimously to end 87 years of school segregation. And then another week later, the school board adopted a desegregation policy. The policy had peculiar characteristics, so I'd like to dwell on the characteristics of the policy because they tell us a lot about what happened subsequently. First, the policy was one of free choice or open enrollment, meaning every child was free to transfer to any school of his or her choice. Or to put it differently, desegregation would be wholly voluntary, depending on parents' choices. Second, the school board said the race of the pupil shall not be a consideration in students' enrollment. And what they meant, first of all, was they would no longer use children's race to send white children into white schools and black children into so-called colored schools. But the second thing they meant was they were no longer going to consider race at all. They were going to assume that students no longer had any race. So in devising a policy to end racial segregation, the school board refused to consider students' race at all in moving forward. So Baltimore school desegregation policy was this: 150,000 students, all assumed not to have any race, were given free choice of schools without any child being required to attend any particular school. And a couple of years later, the superintendent of the time, John Fisher, went on to add, he said, really didn't care, he and other school officials really didn't care what racial makeup resulted anyhow. He said it wasn't clear that any particular composition was better than any other. All that mattered was that students had the right to choose. Now, someone living in Baltimore in 1954, and I can't see all of you out there, but I imagine some of you may have and might own up to it and might talk about your experiences of the time. Someone living in Baltimore in 1954 might have made three kinds of observations about how this kind of policy was likely to play out. The first was that many black schools were outmoded, dilapidated, and unsafe, meaning no parent, whatever their race, whatever their racial views, would reasonably choose such a school for their child. Second, many black teachers had training that was not as good as that of many white teachers, and an important reason was that my institution, the University of Maryland, didn't admit black students. So that most blacks who taught in Baltimore City schools went to Coppin, which was underfunded, it was poorly equipped, it was unaccredited. And they didn't get the training they wanted or the training that they deserved. And because, in fact, the school board was not going to integrate school faculties, the concentration of these teachers in the historically black schools was likely to deter parents from choosing those schools for their children. And then third, Baltimore was a city, and some of you may remember this, but it was a city in mid-century when very few whites or blacks had contact with one another, unless they had commercial relations of buying or selling goods or services. So there was a great deal of anxiety at the racial boundary, meaning people were very anxious about choosing anything associated with the other race. So the reality is that historically black schools presented few choices, and few people felt emotionally free to choose much that was different from what they had already. Oh, and central to the story, I'd like to say something about black leaders in the city. They wanted this policy. They urged this policy on the school board. The NAACP issued press releases taking credit for getting the school board to adopt this policy. The policy survived for 2 decades. Black leaders supported the policy all that time, and this is also important, no civil rights group in Baltimore ever sued the school board to do anything else. And I want to read a little bit from the Baltimore Afro-American in the newspaper story which announced the coming of this new policy. The Afro was a voice of the black middle, is a voice of the black middle class, and it spoke to and for the larger black community. The headline on the story said, "Integration means more opportunities." And what it really meant was opportunities for black individuals more than really for the black race as a collectivity. I'm just going to read a sentence. The Afro says, "The Baltimore school system maintains schools and general classes to fit the needs of the average child, whether a formal or vocational career is planned. The same for children with superior ability and for those whose ability is limited." And really what was important here was that desegregation meant enabling black children with more academic ability to distance themselves from the vocationally inclined. What's important in all of this is there isn't an argument for the school board forcibly mixing white and black students. It's not coming from the black community. So let's look at the results. And I know some of you know them, but let's go over them quickly. First semester was the fall of 1954. Schools opened up. There were 150,000 students in Baltimore City, 60% white, 40% black. Of 58,000 black students, a little under 3%, most of them from middle class and elite black families, chose to attend historically white schools. Among 87,000 whites, 6, it's 0.007%, or pretty close to 0, chose to attend historically black schools. So you could say reasonably, well, look, this is new, it makes people anxious, no one knows how it's going to play out, people want to wait and see what's going to happen, and why don't we look a few years later and see what happens next? So if we go to the fall of 1958, this is after 4 years now, a quarter of black students are now in formerly white schools. And of 86,000 whites, now 58, or 0.07%, are in historically black schools. The number is still very close to 0. And I think this is really the pattern. So after 4 years, we can see a pattern which continued, a pattern of modest and temporary desegregation. Resegregation, meaning historically white schools became preponderantly or entirely black. Departure of white children from Baltimore City schools for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll talk about later on. And then growing and deepening segregation of the schools altogether. In 1960, the schools became majority black, and yet still no one is calling for directed or mandatory integration of schools. So I want to look at the subsequent history of this. And in large part, the pattern's already been set by Baltimore beliefs and culture, and it resists some change. But we can look in the 1960s at a couple events. In 1963, a group of 28 black and white parents, who called themselves the 28 Parents, were joined by the NAACP in charging the school system with continuing segregation of schools, what we might call de facto segregation. But they said, in fact, the school system was culpable because of its policies and practices that contributed to the segregation. And they criticized a number of practices, and I would just single out one of them. The gist of the complaint was these practices limited the choice of black students. They also limited the choice of white students, but they limited the choice of black students, bottling up large numbers of black students in relatively few schools, again, leading to overcrowding, forcing them to attend on shifts. So they were concerned about a number of practices, and one of them was really at the center of the free choice policy, which was a biased administration of the transfer policy. There was an accumulation of anecdotes along the following lines. There would be historically white schools where, as the number of black children transferring in increased, white principal might say to white parents, perhaps it's time for you to consider transferring your child out. Or there would be instances where black parents would go to the principal of their child's school and say, I'd like to transfer my child to such and such a school. And the principal says, I'm not going to approve that transfer because it's not in the educational interest of your child to go to a school so far distant from home. Or there would be other instances where the transfer would go forth, black parents' transfer request would go forth to another school, the school would receive it, it would be put on a waiting list, and it would never emerge from the waiting list. So the NAACP says, we'll sue, and the parents said, let's see if we can negotiate with the school board. And in fact, what the parents wanted was simply truly free choice. They weren't asking anything else. The school board believed in free choice, and after several meetings, the school board said, okay, we'll remove the obstacles to choice. And things proceeded from there. But I think what's important to note is that at this point, 9 years have gone by, patterns have been set, the way free choice worked and its effects were fairly well established. Segregation was increasingly entrenched in the city schools, so that it's unclear how much more could happen with simply freer choice. I'm going to give you a couple numbers quickly. In 1965, this is now 11 years after Brown, the school system is 61% black. I'm going to give you two numbers about elementary school children. The first one is for black children. 5 out of 6 black elementary school children were attending schools at least 90% black. 2 out of 3 white children were attending schools at least 90% white. In other words, black families who wanted their children to attend racially mixed schools, either because they believed in integration or because they believed schools with lots of white children were likely to have the best resources, had diminishing opportunities to choose those schools because whites were not making compatible choices. Or to put it differently, white choices limited black choices. I want to summarize these effects and put it in two different ways. The first, we might say, is free choice was a failure in that, one, it didn't significantly integrate the schools, and two, it didn't noticeably stem white flight. But we can say the same thing again in another very interesting way, which is that white children were leaving the school system white parents were withdrawing their children from the school system despite the fact that most of them had relatively little contact with black children. So I think that's something to come back and try to understand better. In the mid-1960s, civil rights activity in Baltimore as elsewhere heated up. Schools were one of the objects of this activity. And here, as elsewhere, people said, free choice. We have second thoughts about free choice. It's really an effective way of integrating the schools. Baltimore hired 2 integrationist superintendents. In the 1967 mayoral elections, integration, metropolitan desegregation, busing, all of these issues were well discussed. They were at the center of the mayoral campaign. And the winner, who had campaigned for integrating schools and had sought black support and gotten it, was Mayor Tommy D'Alessandro III. So yesterday, our new mayor started. At the same time, in 1967, he got started. He was eagerly working to improve and integrate the schools. He was just gearing up, and then shortly afterward, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. And Baltimore had its first race-related riots. There hadn't been riots earlier in the 1960s. The riots finally ended. When they ended, Governor Spiro T. Agnew summoned 100 black leaders to his office in Annapolis, and then he lectured them. They had expected to be thanked for their work in trying to cool things, and instead he said, "You call yourself moderates, but you've used these words that encourage people to be violent, and therefore you're responsible for the riots," and so forth and so on. And as he went on and on, the black leaders walked out one by one by one. And when he was done, he received hundreds of telegrams, mostly from whites, that said things like, "Thank you for saying what's on the white person's mind, and you should run for president." I know you know how it ended with Spiro Agnew, but be that as it may. It was really a watershed event which ended significant biracial support for integration. Whites were frightened off, and blacks were discouraged off. And yet immediately after that, the Supreme Court came down with a new decision called Green versus New Kent County, which said simply, free choice is an unconstitutional integration measure unless it actually integrates schools. You don't get credit for the process, you have to have results. And so someone asked Baltimore's first black city solicitor, George Russell, who'd been appointed by Mayor D'Alessandro, for a formal opinion on the implications of this for the city's desegregation policy. And so Russell had grown up in segregated black West Baltimore, had gone to all black schools, which he liked, was not a fan of integration, but he said that the Supreme Court was quite clear and Baltimore's desegregation policy was constitutionally inadequate. The mayor, the president of the school board, and the superintendent all ignored the court decision and the judgment about it. One city official, though, was happy to talk about why he wasn't going to talk about it. The city council president at the time was William Donald Schaefer, a man always comfortable saying what he thought, and he said he didn't want to talk about the desegregation policy because, quote, immediately the question of race comes in. In other words, people didn't want to talk about race. The riots had just happened. It was easier to reaffirm free choice than deal with changes mandated by the Supreme Court. And so the city continued with free choice. And then we're going to skip ahead 6 years later. In 1974, the Federal Office for Civil Rights says to Baltimore and to 84 other school districts, you'll develop an integration plan or you're at risk of losing federal education funds. And so Roland Patterson, who was the first permanent black superintendent, said, "No, I don't think so. Free choice is really good for us." And black and white school board members said, "No, we really do like free choice here." And the only people talking about anything different were the Afro and some members of the NAACP who said they were even willing to consider busing, but they were in the minority as far as public black and white opinion went along. So the city school board adopted a modest desegregation plan. The Office for Civil Rights said it wasn't adequate. They negotiated back and forth for about 18 months. Finally, the Office for Civil Rights moved to start withholding funds from the city. And at this point, William Donald Schaefer was mayor and decided to go to court to stop the Office of Civil Rights, get an injunction against their withholding funds. So in January 1976, went to federal court, and I'll spare you a lot of the delicious details of the case. I'll come back later and give you some of the good details. But it goes to the federal district court. The district court rules against the federal government for the city and enjoins Office for Civil Rights from withholding funds. They appeal to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals splits 3-3, essentially upholding the injunction. The Office for Civil Rights is left to continue talking as much as it wanted, but without any sanctions. The lawyers for the city, when they had gone to court, said, we don't want to work under threat. We want to have the discretion to desegregate in ways that fit the customs and the culture and the conditions of the local community. Now they had won. In 1978, with the Fourth Circuit Court decision, they had won. And the president of the school board announced this, but the school board never again did anything to desegregate students. The story, that's really the end of the story. The story formally ends. The 120 years end in 1987. Baltimore schools are 80% black at this point, and the U.S. Department of Education sent a letter to Superintendent Alice Pinderhughes certifying that Baltimore had removed the last vestiges of segregation from the era of legal segregation, and that was the formal end of the story. That was still a quick version of 120 years, but I think we got the highlights. I want to make some observations and look at some questions. I want to start and talk about the failings of free choice. I think the fundamental failing of free choice is that it ignored whites' beliefs and feelings and anxieties about blacks that had led whites to institute segregation in the 19th century and to resist removing it in the 20th. And in this regard, Baltimoreans are no different than anyone else. Primary concern of white parents was about physical intimacy between their children and black children. And I want to give some examples, and you may find them disturbing, and I don't give them to be disturbing, but to give you a sense of the kinds of passions that underlay resistance to removing segregation. When, in 1954, free choice was implemented, there were a number of complaints from white parents in South Baltimore that their children had gotten diseases from black children because they shared the same toilet seats. There were complaints about whites and blacks in mixed swimming classes. They were in the same water together. There was much talk about dancing. Were whites and blacks dancing together? And the dutiful answer always given by either students or adults was, no, they weren't, don't worry. Western High School, just to play it safe, canceled dances in the school, but this was a constant source of concern. There was also a peculiar incident at Western High School shortly after free choice took over. It was in the girls' shower room, and it was several white girls staring at several black girls in the shower room. To one of the black girls said, "And why are you staring at us?" And one of the white girls said, "Well, we heard that blacks have tails, and we wanted to see your tails." I'm going to offer just one other example and then make an observation about these things. In the Baltimore Evening Sun, just after this was announced, and I think the significant part about this is Baltimore had more than one daily newspaper. In the Baltimore Evening Sun, a woman wrote a letter to the editor, and she said, I'm just going to quote a piece of it. "Will my child have to go to a school prom and dance with colored children? Where will these things lead? Suppose then a son or daughter brought home a Negro boy or girlfriend. Suppose they marry. Would you be happy wondering whether your next grandchild would be black or white?" I don't think any of this is unusual. It doesn't distinguish Baltimore from anywhere else. But what I would say is with such primitive anxieties as these, any kind of voluntary, non-coercive desegregation policy simply is not going to mix the races. So that leads us to the first question I want to look at, which is we have well-intentioned, good faith, intelligent school officials. Why did they adopt the policy they adopted? Let me suggest some reasons. The first reason is something I haven't said anything about, so I'll say it quickly. Open enrollment was in fact a historic policy in Baltimore City. Going back to the 19th century, Baltimore had a policy that any white child could transfer to any white school. Any black child could transfer to any so-called colored school. So this was just a continuation of the historic policy, though obviously with one crucial change. So that's one reason. I think also the way that this policy served school officials' wishes to avoid racial conflict also made the policy seem particularly reasonable. For example, it seemed least likely to provoke white resistance because it didn't force anything on whites. Also, it removed school officials from responsibility for dealing in race. And the emphasis on choice as a process over any particular outcome removed the school board from responsibility for monitoring desegregation. And finally, the emphasis on individual choice even removed race as a topic that needed to be discussed. But saying that, I think that they didn't simply select a policy for such reasons. I think it was also an expression of their liberal thinking, which was a common sense way Americans thought in mid-20th century about the society and about the people within it. I'll give an example. Superintendent John Fisher became superintendent in 1953. He was the superintendent in 1954. When he took his job, he was interviewed by a paper and asked about what were his political views and where did they come from. And he said they come from the founding fathers. And then I'm going to read a reporter's paraphrase of what he said. He said, government should be as decentralized as possible, with as high a degree of local autonomy as can be achieved. And the present tendency to do things collectively should be counteracted by providing more opportunities for individual initiative. In his statement, he expresses three assumptions that I think school officials generally shared. One is that society consists of independent, self-interested individuals. They're not part of groups. They're not deeply influenced by groups, such as races. Second, since individuals have conflicting interests and values, what's important is to emphasize the right of individual choice as a way of making decisions, rather than to try to impose any particular outcome on all. And then third, there's a desire to limit the role of government to maximize the discretion of individuals to identify and to serve their interests as they come to see them. And I think free choice, the policy I've described here, is really a quintessentially liberal policy in these terms. And then fourth, and this is really important, black leaders supported free choice. They wanted it. And they supported it for many of the same reasons that whites did. It seemed least likely to rouse white resistance. It avoided talk of race. Also, it left blacks free to stay in all black schools or to move into mixed schools depending on their preference, but without any coercion to do one or the other. That brings us to the second question. How did the desegregation policy and practices influence the racial composition of schools? I think there's one conspicuous way and there's one less conspicuous way that's equally important. The conspicuous way we call in shorthand white flight, but I think it's much more complicated than that. Whites left city public schools for a variety of reasons. They started after the Second World War with the GI Bill and FHA mortgages to buy American dream homes out in the suburbs, and there was nothing racial about their movement. As the city and city schools changed racially, I think a number of whites reacted by choosing to move to the suburbs. But again, what's important to keep in mind is a number of whites were moving their children out despite the fact their children had little contact with black children. I think free choice probably stimulated white withdrawal in an obvious and a less obvious way. The obvious way is it did bring some whites into contact with blacks, and those who didn't like that were moved to leave. But I think there's a second way that free choice worked, and there's a paradoxical way. Free choice meant you'd make a choice about the school your child would be in without knowing with any certainty at all what the actual makeup of the school would be when your child showed up. Because everyone is making all these different choices, everything is uncertain, anxiety can increase because the school board's put its hands behind its back and said, we're not going to regulate anything. So in fact, this policy, which didn't intervene in any way, increased everyone's uncertainty about what the racial makeup of schools would be, added to people's anxiety, and I think for this reason, scared people off and sent them to the suburbs where they could be more confident of making decisions with predictable consequences. So I think that's important. Overall, white departure for the suburbs increased the black majority in the school and helped to make Baltimore the most segregated large school system in America today by this measure. Black child in Baltimore City has less chance of encountering a white child than a black child in any other large school district in America. So it's a long distance to have moved. But I think there's also a second and less obvious way that free choice affected the racial makeup of schools. Free choice enabled the black middle class and the black elite to move their children out of all black schools. They moved their children out because they wanted to and because they could. They had they were aware of a larger world that included whites as well as blacks. They had confidence in moving their children out into that world. They also had the money which they needed to do that. The school system provided transfers but didn't pay for transportation, which meant that parents needed to be able to have money for private cars or for public transportation. And these families did. Also, and it's not a trivial matter, they had money for nice clothes for their children, meaning their children didn't need to worry about being embarrassed about what they were wearing if they went to school with middle-class white children. So they moved out of what had been economically mixed all-black schools. And the effect was really to isolate low-income blacks in schools by themselves. I think that's a real important unintended consequence of this policy. In other words, the policy that was aimed at ending racial segregation contributed to a kind of class segregation. And then in the 1970s, as the black middle class followed the white middle class to the suburbs, the isolation of low-income blacks in Baltimore City schools increased still further. So I think these are two important effects. Let me talk a little bit about what might have happened differently to have contributed to more integration in city schools, and then we'll be at the end. First, the most obvious place to look is what the school board might have done differently. Within the context of free choice, the school board might have renovated or replaced rundown schools. It might have integrated school faculties. It might have conducted human relations efforts to try to deal with and allay the anxiety that members of the races had about encountering one another. It might also, you could argue, have deliberately mixed black and white students. For example, at the same time, Washington, D.C. had biracial zones. Princeton, New Jersey had what came to be called the Princeton Plan. They paired elementary schools, one all-white school, one all-black school. All the students from both schools would attend certain grades in first one building and certain grades in then the other building. And that was done at that time, so that's still another possibility. But an important part of the story is that black leaders wanted free choice. So there's at least a dilemma there if you want to argue for mandatory integration. There's also a crucial event that didn't occur, which if it occurred, things would have gone differently. Blacks didn't sue the school board to integrate. If they had, would have gone to federal court, and conceivably federal court would have implemented an integration plan in the city. But again, two characteristics of Baltimore black leaders matter a lot. One is, as an old established middle class, they had a style of negotiating with white leaders behind the scenes, not confronting in public, not engaging in public conflict, and not litigating. So they were less likely to sue. And second, again, they didn't want forced integration, so they were less likely to sue specifically for that end. So these are events that didn't take place, and if the black leaders had acted differently, things might have come out differently. Finally, there are two chance events that got the city an injunction against the Office for Civil Rights. And if the chance events had gone differently, either of them had gone differently, the Office for Civil Rights could have imposed an integration plan on the city. The first, and I know this is inside baseball stuff, but the first is that the case went to Judge Edward Northrup. He had some unpleasant things to say about Daniel Berrigan in the case he sentenced him in for spilling blood on selective service files. But even though he was a Democrat, he opposed federal interference in what he regarded as local affairs. So this was just such a case where he had many choice words in criticism of the Office for Civil Rights in ruling for the city. If it had gone to someone else, a different judge might have ruled differently. But then finally it went to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I'll tell you a little more than you asked to know, which is this. Originally, the court of 7 voted 4-3 to overturn the injunction. In other words, they ruled against the city for the Office for Civil Rights. But one of the 4 died. He died after he voted, but before the decision was announced. And the city says, you can't count his vote. And so they appealed, and the court reconsidered, and they said, okay, it's 3-3. So it ended up being 3-3. And that meant it upheld the injunction. So if the justice hadn't had a heart attack and died, it also would have come out differently. Let me summarize and conclude. I think Baltimore had a free choice policy that only modestly and temporarily desegregated for a couple kinds of reasons. One is because school officials followed liberalism in a course that relieved them from dealing with race. And the other is because black leaders wanted such a policy. And then I just conclude by saying I think what we see in this story is how Baltimoreans avoid dealing with race and the consequences of this way of doing it for dealing with challenging racial inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to hear from 3 distinguished panelists. I'm going to give a quick introduction to each of them now and then just let them go through their commentary on the talk. First of all, David Andrews, who I can no longer say is the new dean, but is the dean at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. He came to us as the founding dean of Ohio State University's College of Education and Human Ecology, and has been committed throughout his career to improving academic and behavioral outcomes for children and youth. While at Ohio State, Dean Andrews brought together the academic community to address the educational and developmental needs of youth from birth through young adulthood, and he played a key role in developing a model world-class early childhood center in Columbus, Ohio. He also helped to establish the school's service learning initiative, strengthening university community partnerships, and he was the administrator for federally funded longitudinal research studies focusing on the prevention of adolescent and young adult problem behavior. In addition, he founded the Center for Learning Excellence at the John Glenn Institute for Public Service and Public Policy. In 2006, Dean Andrews led the effort to merge 2 colleges at Ohio State into the College of Education and Human Ecology. He also helped build an Ed.D. program to complement the school's PhD program and enhance the school's research portfolio by expanding faculty recruitment efforts. We also have Sonia Santelices, Chief Academic Officer for the Baltimore City Schools. She's a former Boston Public School Administrator and a graduate of the Urban Superintendent's Doctoral Program at Harvard University, a program under which Baltimore City Schools CEO Andres Alonso also studied. Dr. Santelices, who graduated from Brown University, also worked for an education company focused on results, and she was executive director of the New York City Algebra Project, a national nonprofit with a branch in Baltimore that works to empower students to work to improve the education in their communities. We'll also have Catherine Bradshaw, who's an associate professor in the Department of Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she is also co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Prevention and Early Intervention. Her research focuses on bullying and school climate, the development of aggressive and problem behaviors, and the design, implementation, and evaluation of school-based prevention programs. She works with the Maryland State Department of Education, as well as several school districts and national organizations, to support the development and implementation of programs and policies to prevent bullying and school violence, and to foster safe and supportive learning environments. She has a Career Development Award from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for her research on the use of evidence-based violence prevention programs in schools, and she collaborates on federally funded research grants supported by NIMH, NIDA, the CDC, and the Institute of Education Sciences. So I think we'll just start at this end with David Andrews and work our way across.
Great. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. My head is swimming right now with the statistics, and my thought is, I have a couple of thoughts. The first is, I probably should have read your book and heard this presentation before committing to trying to create a mixed income, integrated school in East Baltimore. 120 years is a long time to try to make a difference in that type of history. But I'm also thinking back to my own experience, which is very relevant. I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, in the South during the, you get old enough to live through when people are talking about history. I was there in a district where it started with choice and went to forced busing. Early in my elementary experience, Charles Augustus took advantage of the choice opportunity and joined us as the only black in our elementary school. I invited him to my second grade birthday party in a class of 25. It was a skating party, which were quite the thing at the time, to go to the skating rink. And I remember distinctly my parents telling me that if we invited Charles to the party, it would be Charles and I that would be skating that day. And in reality, what happened was, it was Charles and I and one other white child that skated that day. Fast forward until my high school years, into the high school years, and I was one of the first classes at Booker T. Washington High School in the second year of forced integration, forced busing. The plan was to integrate about 35% of the black kids into the white school and vice versa. I was in the 35% that was assigned to go to the historically black high school, Booker T. Washington. About 12% of us actually went. The rest of the white kids went to private schools in the area. And that's where I spent my high school career and had some interesting insights into the results of forced choice. We also were forced to integrate teachers at the same time. Many interesting things and many interesting experiences that have really shaped my career and my commitment, I think, to thinking deeply about the issues of integration and what needs to be done to help move that forward, and not just racial integration, but I'm much more interested in class integration and socioeconomics associated with this issue. One of the things that, two things that were very obvious. One is that forced integration was absolutely necessary in order to achieve some of the goals that have been achieved in that specific community. About 5 years after I graduated from Booker T. Washington, they tore it down. It was a dilapidated school without windows, and in the condition that you described the Baltimore schools to be in the middle 60s. And 5 years after I graduated, the school was torn down, rebuilt into a state-of-the-art school, and now is about 50-50 in terms of racial integration, and held up as one of the top schools in the state of Florida. That would never have happened without somebody forcing the issue of integration. And what happened in the forcing of the integration was not only racial integration, but was socioeconomic integration at the same time. And breaking that mix was essential to moving us forward. One of the more shocking things in that experience was that my classes within Booker T. Washington High School were predominantly white, because we had various opportunities for advanced placement and advanced work that had led to our preparation among the white kids that were coming from traditionally all white schools, and so those who were prepared for the advanced classes were all segregated within the school because of previous opportunities. So it's also shaped me into thinking about the importance of starting incredibly early with equal opportunities across race and across class, because if we're not starting early in the equality of opportunities, we're going to find out that later on preparation plays as big a role in opportunity and segregation as any policy related to integration. So both of those features have affected the way that I think about integration and the necessity of taking pretty strong and dramatic action in order to create the opportunities that our students deserve. I am involved with the East Baltimore Community School in an effort to create, I think the most exciting opportunity there is the effort to try to do whatever is possible to create a mixed income, mixed race community, which, as we've heard, is so rare in Baltimore, and to use that as a pilot for some of the things that are necessary to move the agenda forward. Stop there.
I like being on panels with David because I learn more about him every panel I'm on with him. We were on a panel earlier this year about play, and I got a chance to hear what his favorite games were as a child, and so now I get to hear a little bit more. So this is great.
I sang then, didn't I?
You did sing. You did sing. So I get a little bit more each time. And then as part of my welcome package of reading when I entered Baltimore City as the chief academic officer about a year and a half ago, although it's probably longer now, maybe a year and 8 months. One of the first readings that I had as a gift was Dr. Baum's book, and so I brought my copy, even though I was late to get my autographed copy. And it was actually a fascinating read. And coming from working and growing up, frankly, north of Boston, that also has a very storied desegregation history that I think in many ways is still very present in the water and in the air of schooling in Boston. It was very interesting to enter a city coming from that, where I remember as an assistant superintendent being charged by Tom Payson, who I was interning with at the time, who was the superintendent, to go into South Boston High School to visit a school. And now this is the year 2000, right? And I remember growing up north of Boston and my parents not allowing me, even though I was growing up in a predominantly white suburb, not allowing me to go to the Bunker Hill Monument field trip because that was a site of violence, right? And so that was not a place. And so then to have, however many years later, have my superintendent charge me with going into the middle of the city, I had some emotional dissonance, to say the least. So coming from that setting where it's very present, very volatile even now, to the point where people who aren't from the area come in and say, why are you guys still talking about what happened in 1970 plus, to come into Baltimore and to have a very different context. And to frankly find discussions of race and class take on a very different feel. And so some of this, from an anthropological standpoint, informal, not by training, was interesting because I would bring up issues of race and class very comfortably within the school system early on. And people, both black and white, would kind of look. Like, well, why are you bringing up that? And I say that to say that some of that, what was interesting and fascinating about hearing in a very concise and very pointed analysis, was interesting because I could view it. I viewed it kind of live and in living color over the last year and a half. And a lot of it is very palpable, but in a different way in the school system. One or 2 points before I turn it over that I'd like to point out is this issue of the isolation of lower income blacks in Baltimore City schools. And it's one of the things that has been very interesting as I have, again, unbeknownst to me, well, not unbeknownst, but deliberately to me, tried to surface discussions about race and class within the confines of Baltimore City current schooling. And it harkens back to some of William Julius Wilson's early work, right, about the differences in urban communities. And I think that this idea of the isolation of lower income African Americans is one of the narratives that we have not fully explored the impact of. And we haven't fully acknowledged as a school system. We do somewhat internally. I think Dr. Alonso has masterfully, and I tell him I don't want his job, he has masterfully pushed the envelope on the perception of who Baltimore City schools are for. And I think that's in large part why there is a lot of excitement and interest, if nothing else, in city schools in a number of sectors. But from a practical day-to-day standpoint of what my work is, which is the instructional improvement for every student in every classroom every day in the city of Baltimore, the tension around what it means to educate students in a system that has a significantly high concentration of lower income African American students is really the emergence of this issue of race and class. And it plays out in expectations, both as an educator when I walk into classrooms, and I would be dishonest if I didn't say that when I encounter paltry, and I'll say paltry to be kind, instruction and learning experiences, that I don't often question, right, whether if the composition, both in terms of economics and in terms of race, were different in the class that I was in, would the same people be responding differently, right, based on that. And it's a constant, both as a parent, right, in making the decision to have my child in Baltimore City Public Schools, even while I work here, this idea that the expectation, the resourcing, the accountability, which I think has shifted over the last 4 years, I think is directly correlated to part of that legacy. And that what happens, and there are people who have come to me and said, well, which school is your kid in? And part of it is like, well, you should go visit. Like, you don't need to know from me. But part of it is kind of this real, palpable experience for people that if your kid, meaning if my kid is there, somehow I know certain things are going to occur. And I think part of the rub for me internally is that fundamentally I don't believe you should have to have a school that's racially and economically diverse to have excellence. That goal should be because it makes us a better society, right? For all of those reasons that those of us who believe in diversity, right, believe in. But the political reality is such that for people on a daily basis, that's not their first entry point. Their first entry point is, it is the integration that guarantees that that is the safety net, right? When as David referred to, you know, this idea that, you know, we've got to ensure that it's still going to happen. There's a real palpable feeling in the daily lives of people that if there is a diverse, if other people's kids are there with mine, then I know good things are going to happen. And that's the piece that actually is troubling to me. And I think that's the piece that I wrestle with on a daily basis. And so this idea of where we are and what the kind of vestiges of desegregation are is one that forces that question. And I would just end, and I'm going to turn it over to you, saying that I started out in urban education not believing that you needed integration to get excellence, and I'll just be transparent about that. I had two parents who grew up in predominantly African American communities in Georgia and Mississippi. Father went to Morehouse and to Howard for graduate school, and so I grew up thinking, even in the midst of being the only black child in my class in school for years, so getting to Brown, I actually thought there were lots of black people. I was like, really? There's this many? So that was interesting for me. That I had, you know, for a long time had been fostered by my parents, this belief that there was this tradition of excellence in African American communities that did not necessarily make us dependent on integration for that excellence. And I think the shifts that have occurred as part of the desegregation and what we're faced with now has flipped that a bit on its head, right? And where that occurs and how that occurs, and even though my daily work in a district where 85%, right, are African American, I have to believe that that is true, but it requires a political and a community will to affirm that that is true as our actions, you know, in terms of resourcing decisions and everything else come to play. So I will end with that and turn it over to Dr. Bradshaw.
Well, it's great to be part of this panel here and to do some thinking around this issue. I'm involved in a series of projects around disparities in education, and so I kind of come at this from the programmatic endpoint of where are we now and what are we trying to do about some of these challenges, because just the fact of desegregating the schools doesn't break up those inequities that we see. We continue to see very gross disparities in terms of the outcomes of students. And I won't bore you with a lot of the details. In fact, I find them very troubling when we look at disparities with regard to academic achievement, discipline problems, high school graduation. For example, with graduation rates, Latino students are a third as likely to drop out, or 3 times as likely to drop out of high school as their white counterparts, and African Americans are twice as likely. Baltimore City, unfortunately, has been referred to as the dropout factory, given its history of really high rates of dropouts. So we know that those problem behaviors and those challenges are really concentrated, particularly in urban areas. And so as we start to think, well, what do we do about this? So the desegregation, given the process, certainly could have been improved, but given where we are now, how do we go forward? And how do we begin to address these disparities? And one area that comes up pretty commonly is to provide professional development to teachers, and much of that happens, if it does happen at all, it happens post-service. So as I've often heard the dean talk about, where is the training in classroom management and pre-service training? And it's very few places. Quite often it's peppered into a class here and there, but really is something that falls through the cracks. And I would argue that our training in cultural proficiency and working with culturally and linguistically diverse students has a similar type of process, that occasionally it might be a class that a teacher gets, or perhaps ideally it would be integrated into all the course material, but that's rarely the case. So I think sadly many of our teachers are entering the field with very little training, and we know that this is particularly disheartening because the vast majority of the teachers entering the field, about only 9%, are African American or other ethnic minorities, whereas the growing population of students, typically around 40%, are ethnic minorities. So we have a real disconnect in terms of the backgrounds of the teachers, and that doesn't, we're not going to be able to solve that problem totally. We could certainly increase our recruitment, but we want to have all staff to be culturally proficient. And so how do we get that? What does that look like? What does that mean? Does it mean that we have to talk about issues of race and equity? And we would argue that is the case, but that really does lead to a lot of anxiety among teachers, a lot of guilt, a lot of shutting down of conversations. So we're involved in one of a federally funded research project now where we're partnering with Anne Arundel County, who, if you read the Sun newspaper a couple months ago, you heard that they're currently operating under an Office of Civil Rights negotiated agreement with the NAACP. In fact, the NAACP just refiled the initial claim that came in 2004. And in that, they focus primarily on African American youth and disproportionate handling of or inappropriate handling of discipline problems. So over referrals to special education, suspensions, other disciplinary infractions. And so our team is very interested in academic outcomes, but my area of expertise tends to be a little more focused on discipline problems and how we handle the behavior, because if you can't get the kids in the classroom, if you can't get them focused on the content, they're never really going to learn. And so that area has been really a great concern to us, and where we're focused kind of moving forward. And many of the school districts will have trainings, a professional development day here and there about cultural proficiency, but we actually have very little outcome data to show that any of that works. So we're in the process of finishing a systematic review around this topic, and we really can't find any empirical data to show that just doing a professional development actually reduces disproportionality. It might change some attitudes, it might change an intent or perceived efficacy, but we really don't have any data on outcomes. In fact, we don't have any data that anything per se really reduces some of these disparities with regard to handling of behavior problems. While we have a number of different interventions that we can use to cut down overall on discipline problems, we don't really see that any of those are closing the gap. So many of the programs that we are involved with, the Good Behavior Game, one for example that has been studied pretty rigorously here in Baltimore City, you similarly see a main effect of the intervention, but not one that's impacting African American students any better than it is Caucasian students. Other programs that we work with, they often have a main effect, but we don't really see that they're really closing that gap. And in some cases, they actually might work less effectively for African American students than they do for their Caucasian peers. So this is really an area where we need to be doing much more research. And we're currently involved in a project with the School of Education and Mike Rosenberg and some of our colleagues in Anne Arundel County to try to address this by providing teachers with some training around skill development. So we have kind of an approach where we're trying to encourage the teachers to reflect on their own cultural values and their own experiences and hold that mirror up, but also to gain recognition of the students in their classroom, where they've come from. But in addition to that self-reflection process, we also wanted to be able to give them some skills and strategies. But this is where things can become tricky, because sometimes teachers will say, well, what do I do with African American students? What do I do with my Asian students? What do I do with my Hispanic students? And we don't want to have that kind of cookie cutter type of approach, but that's often the kind of question that we get. So as I pose the questions to the audience and to the rest of the panel, how do we move forward? After we've desegregated, what do we do to really continue to address some of these disparities? Because I don't think the desegregation, and we have clear evidence that that's not reducing these disparities. We need to provide some additional training and additional support to be able to do this. And by no means do I think teachers come to school each day saying, I want to belittle my students, I want to put students down, or I want to over-refer students to the office. But in fact, we have data showing that even after you take into account a teacher's own rating of students' behavior problems, so we essentially give the teachers a checklist and we say, rate your students' behavior problems in the classroom. So we're able to adjust for that, and we still find that the African American students are 30% more likely to be sent to the office than their white counterparts that are in the same classroom and that have the same levels of behavior problems. So clearly there's some great challenges. We see that some of these softer offenses, things like disrespect, are really a major concern when it comes to getting sent to the office, which many of you probably in this room were never sent to the office, but that is actually a very good indicator of some challenges that are happening. There's some longitudinal research about the predictive validity of office discipline referrals. We've done some work around the validity of them. Are they really good indicator of the student's behavior? Well, they're a pretty good indicator, but the rest of the variance is really probably the bias from the teacher, the way that they perceive that student's behavior. So I think there are a number of challenges as we start to think about how we bridge where we've been historically and where we go forward, trying to get some of these innovations into teacher practice so that way they're implemented every day. Part of our work is we're providing some professional development for teachers to become more aware, and the data is often a critical piece of that. Bringing data in, not just from the state or nationally, but saying, these are the data in your school. That is a real showstopper when you get into a school, and we just did a training last week where I presented some of the data for our team. And the teachers, there's a lot of denial of the data and questions about the data, and you have to really go through and know your numbers when you're sharing the data. But that's really a critical piece for helping them own the problem and recognize where the challenges are. In addition to the kind of school-wide professional development we're also doing individual coaching and some small group learning, because we don't think this is all going to be handled in an hour or two of professional development. It's going to take that one-on-one work that's facilitated by a coach that's going to help you, and we're using strategies like motivational interviewing to help teachers understand ways that they can actually adopt some of their practices to try to reach out more and be more inclusive to their linguistically diverse students and culturally diverse students in their class.
Great, thank you all very much. Dr. Fromm, I want to give you a chance to respond if you want, but I also want to make sure we get people up. So I'm going to ask people, we're going to have a microphone on each side of the room if people want to line up to ask questions. We do want this to be a conversation, but we also want to make sure that that means that you leave time for other people to come up and ask questions. So we're going to ask you to try and keep questions brief. But if you want to take a moment to respond to the panelists while people come up, feel free.
I'm going to be very brief. I think the comments are all very thoughtful. The personal stories as well as the professional stories, I think, are significant. I just underline a couple things that caught my attention. I think it is important for the city school system to try to understand the implications and impacts of having large, isolated, low-income black populations. I think it's a hard problem. And I'm struck by your observation that it's hard to talk. It's maybe harder here than it's normally hard elsewhere in America to talk about race and class. And that's really at the root of the things that everyone is talking about. So I just think those are important observations.
Come on up to either microphone if you've got a question.
Hi, I'm sorry. I just want to know what your opinion is of the impact of the charter schools in Baltimore City.
I can talk charters. So charters are interesting in that I think, one, they have certainly expanded choice, right? But I was very mindful of the charter mantra of choice in light of Dr. Baum's presentation.
Absolutely.
That it is not just mere choice and the placing of choice that ensures the equity that all of us want to see in schools. So that part is there. I think what's interesting about charters, as I've gotten out to more of them to actually experience, is the opportunity they provide for families who still have trepidations about city schools, right? And I'm just being transparent and anecdotal, right? But who still have reservations about, well, city schools really to the point it needs to be. And it helps those families dip a toe in the water, right? One, because there's more local, there's the perception of, or in some ways actualized, more local control at the school level. So that I think when you sign on as a parent or a community member with children within charter schools, it provides that, if nothing else, the idea that I have more say, right? That I have more impact. You have charter schools who have the freedom, and again, Dr. Alonso is very big on saying, we have autonomies for all schools, but I think it's one thing to have autonomy and another thing to believe you can act on it. And I think so in a lot of charter schools, what you see is a proactivity around maximizing the autonomy to shape and cater schooling for their public, right? Which is that. So in that sense, I think charters are helping to really push the envelope on who attends Baltimore City Public Schools. I will also say that I think charters are struggling with the same questions around quality of instruction, around expectations. They're facing some similar questions about who's attending and who's performing, right? So you might have more income diversity, for example, in a charter school. But the question of who's performing and who's not, right? So some of the pieces that that Dr. Bradshaw brought up about, well, we can integrate all we want to, but we're still left with the same kids we had before we integrated, and so how are we going to deal with those achievement issues? So I think that the charters have helped expand the conversation. We have families who I don't believe would be in city schools if we didn't have charter schools, and that helps. But I also think the extent to which charter schools are actually going to contribute at the next level of impact is the extent to which they are asking themselves the deepening questions about instructional impact and not riding on the fact that they've got great PR and they're really good, and I said this earlier in another context, by and large charter schools are very good at listening to their public, right, and making sure that the basic building blocks of schooling, but that's not true for every charter. Like we have some charters that I'm looking at now. I'm kind of like, well, we need to revisit. But I think this issue of educational excellence, they are facing as well. I don't think it's a done deal.
Good afternoon. I have a couple of questions. One for Dr. Ballman, the one for the rest of the panel. The first question, Dr. Baum, is as a result of the GI Bill and the expansion of suburbia, in particular in Baltimore County was marketed as a white community only. You know, this is something that they wanted to achieve. I'd like you to speak to, in particular, how that impacted Baltimore, how that may have impacted Baltimore policy, especially given the fact that in Baltimore County early along, they didn't educate black students beyond high school unless they had taken a test. And then, you know, if they'd taken a test, then they could go back into Douglas, and Baltimore County would support that. So I wanted to know if you stepped upon that at all, if you found any relationships between what was going on in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. My second question is with respect to industry in Baltimore. And I kind of see education as a vehicle into industry. You know, we go to school to get better jobs. It's not very difficult to look around Baltimore and to see that there are very few black professionals in Baltimore. And there have been very few black professionals in Baltimore since segregation ended. I mean, most folks who, you know, do well in this town leave and go off to someplace else because they see that they have better opportunities. I want you guys on the panel to speak to how that might impact the goals that you have in front of you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Baltimore County. I think the implications of what you're saying are pretty straightforward. As you said, Baltimore County for a long time had no high school for black students, and black students who wanted to attend high school would have to pass. White students didn't have to, but black Baltimore County students who wanted to attend high school would have to take an exam, and if they were passed, they were then sent to Douglas High School in Baltimore City, where they added to the overcrowding at Douglas High School. And one of Thurgood Marshall's early actions was to sue and try to get the county to build a high school for blacks. Baltimore County, because the Federal Housing Administration didn't insure mortgages in racially mixed areas, or areas that had Jews and Gentiles for that matter, it essentially helped to create all-white suburbs, with the exception of blacks who could pay out of pocket. It was very difficult to buy a suburban home. So suburbs acquired racial meaning. And we can look at Baltimore County, for example, which didn't build public housing. So one of the consequences of not building public housing is that low-income residents didn't move to Baltimore County to live in subsidized housing, but Baltimore City had a greater burden of housing low-income residents. We can say that these actions contributed to the segregation of Baltimore City schools. Melvin Sykes, who's a longtime lawyer in Baltimore City, once drafted the most creative, thoughtful suit I've seen. He never filed it because he needed money to prosecute it and couldn't get money to file it. But it was a suit in which he charged, among others, Baltimore County officials for contributing to the segregation of Baltimore City schools, and listed a number of actions they'd engaged in, including things like not providing public housing and so forth, and forcing the burden of looking after low-income residents, a significant proportion of them black, in the city. So I think the implications are the ones you suggest, and I think they obviously are important. But by law, but given the court standards of responsibility, it's very difficult to demonstrate in a court of law that Baltimore County is responsible for some amount of segregation in city schools.
I could start with the flight of talent, paralleling the flight of industry. I think that's a pretty obvious relationship. Probably not that useful to go into which drives the other. But we also know that in communities where there's a lack of corporate and industry involvement in education, we're seeing fewer opportunities. I come from Columbus, Ohio, where corporate and industry involvement in the educational agenda was extensive, and it's been conspicuously absent here in Baltimore since my arrival, which has been somewhat shocking.
Sorry. Do you want to follow? I'm curious to know what the panelist thinks about I think it's the U.S. Department moving to opportunity intervention, which provides vouchers for low-income families to move into upper or middle high-income neighborhoods. If you could speak about that.
I know a little bit about MTO, or do you want to start?
You want to start? I'll pick up after you.
Yeah, so the Moving to Opportunities initiative that was funded by HUD, and Baltimore was one of the sites. I think there were 9 across the country. There's been some very interesting work to follow up on the families and the impacts on the children as well as the parents' health.
Just briefly, there are people I'm sure who do not know Moving to Opportunities.
Sure.
Can you just briefly summarize it?
Sure. So it was a federal initiative put out by Housing and Urban Development, targeting about 9 different large communities across the country. Baltimore was one, New York, Chicago, LA, pretty much those big hubs. There were some researchers here at Hopkins. Tama Leventhal, who was here for a number of years, was involved in some of the research studies both in New York and here in Baltimore. And so they, in terms of the details, and perhaps if you're involved with this, you could elaborate on the details, but generally what was provided is families were provided an option of receiving vouchers that would allow them to move to Section 8 housing in more diverse areas. Typically, they were pretty white areas where they were allowed to move, and provided the opportunity and resources and some coaching to be able to help them lease up in the areas. There were some challenges with regard to the actual implementation. While families were provided these vouchers, there were some families that never actually leased up because they chose not to relocate. You could never force the relocation. But some families would move and then they would move back because they had family or other individuals living locally. So when they did find that there were some moves, the families that did move and actually stayed out in those more diverse communities, there were some positive gains, although there were some mixed effects with regard to the kids and gender. I think the girls did better than the boys. Some hypotheses about the boys actually relocating back to their neighborhood communities, and so they didn't really lose in terms of their social network. They were still exposed to some deviant peers and gang affiliation. But there were some health outcomes, and there were also some site differences. I think New York had a little bit stronger effects for some of the youth outcomes than perhaps Baltimore. But I think what's interesting, and that was actually a large demonstration, it had a randomization component of it, and there were a lot of economists involved with it, trying to look at economic opportunities as well as child outcomes and family health outcomes as well. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. But it was really based on an earlier experiment that happened as a result of a lawsuit in Chicago where families were provided an opportunity to relocate, and there were some positive effects, but there was no randomization component of that. And so there was a question of who moves versus who stays, and that was what was nice about the design for the MTO. So I think what's really nice about that, kind of invoking again the work of William Julius Wilson, and Chicago was kind of where the big housing mobilization efforts really started. But the goal there was really trying to reduce the concentration of poverty. And so the families couldn't just relocate anywhere. They had to relocate to communities where there were certain threshold for the concentration of poverty, because you're trying to create more heterogeneous communities. So I think there are some, it's one of those it's one of those initiatives that you're like, wow, I really wish that worked across the board. And while there were certainly some successes with it, I think there were some areas that with regard to implementation, being able to support the families, making those choices to move, feeling confident and having a social network after they move. Transportation also was a challenge. So when you had families that relocated back to where they were before, I think that's potentially where you had some of the lost opportunity for positive gains.
I made a list of 4 nearly feasible scenarios for increasing integration in Baltimore City schools, and that was half of the second one on my list. I'm happy to give the others, but this 2-part scenario might go. In other words, the question is, here we are today. If we think integration matters for some reasons, how might we increase it? And it seems to me something like Move to Opportunity, if designed well, we need a federal program to provide funding for literally money, but also support for housing and so forth. A program would enable people voluntarily, low-income people of any race, to move from Baltimore City to suburbs, to communities of opportunity. Communities of opportunity would mean places with affordable housing, with employment, and I know that's a tricky part right now in general, but still, employment and good schools. If a program like that would make it possible for black as well as white poor people to move to suburbs, so it at least contributes in some small way to mixing people in the suburbs. And then the second part of that is what the school system is doing now, which is trying to make city schools as good as possible to attract back in middle-class families, white, black, or other, who have choices. So obviously the kink is the federal government willing to fund something like this, given its mixed experiences with it in the past? Don't know, but that would help both move people out and draw people in. So that's worth thinking about as one of the, perhaps closer to possible, of a number of scenarios for increasing integration in the city schools.
I think we can take one more. So.
Thank you all so much for your time. Dr. Andrews, when you mentioned about how in your high school you mostly had classes with other white students, that made me think of my school district in North Carolina that I graduated from, where all of our schools were integrated, but all of our advanced placement courses were taught in one building in the center of the county, and you had, more often than not, you needed a car to get over there to take these classes and take advantage of the opportunity. So not only was it creating income disparities, but I think there's also concerns about issues of tracking, which is what I was hoping any of you could address. How do you limit concerns about that taking place even in integrated schools? So having either counselors or teachers impose judgments and restricting the abilities of students. And I guess I was curious if you've experienced in Baltimore City schools whether high achieving students are ever sort of directed out of the system, and that sort of inspiration or model is taken away, further limiting the exposure of some of the lower income students.
I want to start on that one. Can I? Absolutely. Well, I think this is an important issue because, of the comorbidity issue among, poverty and ability level, across races, but especially in a city where we have a high concentration of one race that's in severe poverty. We have to think about ability mixes in our schools in the same way the resulting, the result of having low opportunities lead to less prepared students who are aggregated together in schools with teachers who aren't the greatest either. It's a disastrous combination. We have an article just came out in Child Development of last month, looking purely at language development and ability level. When you have such a concentration of understimulated, low ability, high poverty students, the teacher, even a great teacher, can't provide enough language enrichment opportunities or stimulation as one person to parallel what happens in a school that even has any kind of mixed ability and peers who are in that school who are able to generate the type of language models and examples that are necessary to get kids where they need to be. So now we're seeing, the grouping, the inadvertent low ability groupings in our most challenging schools, providing an additional challenge, to those students. So we have to think, and we also know on the other side of the coin that mixed ability groupings, one, are phenomenal for raising the level of achievement for those lower performing students, and two, does no harm for high performing students. So we have no evidence that high performing students excel above and beyond their capacity in mixed groups when they're all brought together in a group of high performing students. So I think we have to, we don't want to talk about this any more than we want to talk about race. But mixed ability groupings and the flight of ability out of our schools that's based on previous opportunity is another challenge that people aren't really willing to talk about very openly.
I concur. And I think one of the pieces that's interesting in how David answered the question is, one, we have been discussing ways around the state's absolutely correct prioritization of low-income students for access to pre-K, right? Which is absolutely the right priority, absolutely what we should be doing. The problem with that is that we know, particularly in the early grades, if we're teaching the way we should be, right, with lots of interaction between students, lots of doing and, conversations over the water table, right, having snack together, responding to the stories, doing dramatic play together, that's the most opportune time for students from a variety of backgrounds to actually mix and know that it's going to have an impact. So what we've been looking at in Baltimore City is ways, not necessarily around it, we still want to prioritize the kids that need it most, but how do we attract greater balance in families so that kids are actually getting the mixed group. And a great example of that, was in my daughter's pre-K class last year. They each had to bring in, I don't know, something for their letter. They had a letter of the day or some such thing. And her name begins with K. And so she decided she wanted to bring in the kimono that I brought her back from Japan in for her day. Well, it turned into this whole lesson right around Japan in a pre-K class. And she got a chance to talk, and she benefited because she had peers who asked about, well, what is this? Why is the cat such an important symbol of luck? Why does it mean luck? And why do you have a little bat? So, and I say that does not say that certainly my child also learned from other peers, but to say that, one of the things her teacher said to me is there are kids in here who would never have had that kind of interaction, right? Had that not been the case, right? Had my child, and you could say that about other children, there are things she's brought home, and I think she's better for being in a mixed socioeconomic and racially diverse class as well. There are things that she's much more comfortable with. She's much more confident, and she was one of the only African American kids in her independent school back in Boston, and there are things now she's much more comfortable like wearing her hair in Afro puffs and all that kind of stuff than she was when everybody just had the headbands and the hair flowing down the back, right? She's a lot more confident in certain areas. So there are pluses on both sides. I think the second piece that we're grappling with, particularly at the middle grades level, and again, I absolutely believe in, the mixed ability grouping. I think what we're finding is in middle grades with large concentrations of students of color and large concentrations of, and even the smattering of, not even large concentrations, but the smattering of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, that frankly what I have walked into is a misalignment around what high achievement looks like. So I had no intention of entering Baltimore. Anybody in Boston can tell you that. I didn't care about the kids at Boston Land School. Not that I didn't care about them, but I was like, those kids are going to be fine, right? That was our elite high school. And I came here and walked into, and I don't know if anybody from Poly City or Western is here, but I pretty much unbraided folks. Like, I did walks through those schools and unbraided people and said, you've got to be kidding me. Like, this is not national standard, and you can't make me believe that if we shifted the population of kids that were in these schools, your perception of what performance, high performance looks like would not change. And part of that was, in fact, the perception and the need to recalibrate. But part of what I learned from the teachers and the principals doing the work is the kids that are coming to us, and again it gets into David's background, don't have the background initially, right, to engage at those high levels. So part of what we've started doing, and I don't want to go down in Dr. Baum's next decade book commentary as the woman who helped to, retrack Baltimore City schools, but what we have done is we have reinstituted honors programming in middle grades because we've had to, because there hasn't been that drive, and so that even though there might be people who say, well, some of the families withdrawing don't want their children to be around poor children or black children, and that's why we can, even in some of our most diverse schools, we can track when middle class families who engage us in early elementary leave, and it's around 4th or 5th grade. And so part of what we found is, when I started looking, was, well, some of this might be people's inhibitions, but some of it is the actual lack of rigorous instruction and rigorous programming and curricula. And so what we've done is now we have made sure that it's open access, right? So it's not you only score here and that's the only way you can get in. So we've done some creative things with that, but we have reinstituted honors programming in the middle school just because we don't have the pipeline. We don't have a mass pipeline, and so we've had to reinstitute some of that and revamp it. And what I call it is a recalibration period of what exactly is high performance. And what does the pipeline to advanced placement look like? So we have done some work around that.
Given the time, I think that's going to be the last word. On behalf of the Urban Health Institute and our partners, Baltimore City Schools and the Johns Hopkins School of Education, I'd like you to join me in thanking all of our panelists and then especially Dr. Howell Baum. For anyone who's interested, there are going to be copies of his book for sale and a book signing outside at the Wall of Wonder, which I've been assured everyone knows what it is, but if you go out to the left and then look to your right, you'll see it and you'll know that's the Wall of Wonder. So thank you very much.